I use math to study things.
Math. Photon.
Electron.
Photon.
I use math to study things.
Photon.
Electron.
Photon. Photon.
Hello, I'm Ian Knowles, the Artistic Director and Theatre Manager here at Chelmsford City Theatres. Welcome to the digital version of Chelmsford Civic Theatre. This is the second of our online Zoom performances as part of Essex 2020 in partnership with the amazing Electric Voice Theatre and Essex Music Education Hub. Welcome back to everyone who joined us last week for the first of these sessions about Margaret Cavendish, which I believe will shortly be available on our YouTube channel. And welcome to anyone new who's also joining tonight. For tonight's performance, please look at the chat notes on how to pin the live BSL sign language interpreter video to your screen for people wishing to follow the signing of this event. And also look at the chat notes for any other technical issues. There will be a Q&A session after the performance tonight, so if you have any questions for any of the artists and experts, please send them to everyone in the chat box. As in the live theatre, please put microphones and mobile phones on silent, and please turn your camera off, otherwise you will be filmed and you will be seen no matter where you are and what you are doing. Turning now to tonight's performance of Stratford's scientific poet, Elizabeth Tollet. The programme starts in just a moment even, with a musical piece entitled Maths, followed by the presentation on Elizabeth Tollet by Dr. Patricia Fara. Sarah Clay from British Aerospace Systems will provide a presentation on her work, followed by a short discussion. We end this performance tonight with a fantastic digital animation by artist Jack Cornell. Finally, we're going to open the virtual bar to you, our audience, so our experts and performers can respond to all of your questions. So to start things off tonight, I am very proud to welcome to the Civic stage from the Electric Voice Theatre Artistic Director, Composer and Soprano, Frances Lynch, as I invite again everyone to sit back, relax and enjoys tonight's performance of Echoes from Essex Soundings to Elizabeth Stratford's Scientific Poet. Thank you.
Math. It. Math. It. Math. It is. Math. It is. Mathematics. Impossible. No, it is impossible to... Will you stop interrupting? Math. It is impossible to... Math. It is impossible to be... Math. It is impossible to be... It is impossible to be... Thank you. Mathematician. Well, certainly not one as good as Mary Somerville or Ada Lovelace or Elizabeth Tollet or Florence Nightingale. Mathematician. To be a mathematician. No. Without being a no, without being a no, a poet. A poet. A poet in the soul. Think of Elizabeth Tollet. She understood Newtonian mathematics, but chose to enter scientific discourse through anonymous poetry. It is impossible to be a mathematician without being a poet. A poet in soul. In 1694, Elizabeth Tollet was born, and her father gave her an education far above that of other women of the time. He recognised her extraordinary genius. And so she was able to speak fluently and clearly in the Latin, Italian and French languages, and she understood poetry, history and the mathematics. Strength in numbers, strength in numbers. Maths makes trade and travel. Maths divides war and peace. Maths makes money, money, money. Maths calculates life and death. Maths parallels form and beauty. Maths equals maps and models without. It is impossible. Elizabeth Tollet grew up in the Tower of London, where Isaac Newton was living at the time. She understood his scientific ideas and passed them on to others through her poetry. You see, women found ways of expressing and engaging in science, despite their intellectual and actual imprisonments. Here was a quiet Minerva, a determined Mathematica, clothed in poetry. Time and tide, wait for no woman. Time and tide, wait for no woman. Minerva Mathematica, Minerva Mathematica, Mathematica. Maths! Women who make maths count.
Elizabeth Tollet met Isaac Newton, inherited enough money to buy her own home, and decided to spend the rest of her life in Essex. Her England was very different from ours. There's a famous saying, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. Learning about Elizabeth Tollet's life certainly makes you feel that's true. She spent around 20 years living in the Tower of London, but she wasn't a prisoner. Her father worked there as a naval official, and the Tower was home to many families with children. But it was also an isolated fortress, bristling with soldiers and guns, and there was no bridge over the Thames. Later on, she moved to Stratford in Essex, and that has also become a vanished foreign country. Stratford is now part of Tower Hamlets, but it was once a small picturesque village in Essex. The map on the right shows you just how small. She was living in Essex when the local porcelain factory opened. There's a cake dish on the left, but I like to imagine her using the item on the right, which is an inkwell. Reading and writing were her favourite occupations. She loved studying, and she was extremely envious of her younger brother at Cambridge University, from which women were banned. She suspected that he was spending much of his time drinking and gambling, but that was exactly where she would have liked to be. She sent him a poem urging him to take advantage of his male privilege and to study like she was doing by herself at home.
All day I pensive sit, but not alone. I have the best companions when I've none. Thrice happy you in learning's other seat.
In that foreign country of the past, men and women were regarded completely differently. Women were basically the property of either their father or their husband. So this man owns his house, his wife, and his dogs. Dogs were a common symbol for female fidelity and obedience. In her poetry, Elizabeth Tollet protested about women's domestic confinement.
What cruel laws depress the female kind to humble cares and servile tasks confined?
Children were also treated. Left, you can see the father with his eldest son, set apart on the right, and the mother with a younger son. Became the property of their brother until they married. Boys received far more education, and Tollet protested,
Is this a crime for female minds to share the early influence of instructive care?
However, she was unusually lucky because her father was a very enlightened man who made sure she studied all the subjects usually reserved for boys, such as Latin and Greek and mathematics. And because women were subordinate to men, far less information about them was recorded or preserved. As Winston Churchill put it, history is written by the victors, and here they are, 3 men. It's exactly the same in the history of science, which is usually told as a succession of great male geniuses. So here are 3 of those heroes, Newton, Galileo, and Einstein. But of course, they weren't alone. Science is a collective endeavor, and many less famous men made crucial contributions. Unsurprisingly, Elizabeth Tollet didn't agree that men should dominate science by excluding women from education.
That haughty man, unrivaled and alone, may boast the word of science for his own, as barbarous tyrants to secure their sway. Conquerors that ignorance will best obey.
And in fact, many women were involved in science and maths. They couldn't go to university, so very few of them could carry out original research, but they were certainly interested. When a magazine called The Lady's Diary decided to stop publishing its page of mathematics puzzles, they were inundated with angry letters from women who enjoyed working them out. And so the editor reinstated the maths section. Women made important contributions to scientific progress because they undertook the vital role of communicating scientific ideas. So according to the famous myth, Isaac Newton invented gravity by watching an apple fall from a tree, but he was extremely bad at communicating his ideas. So there's no point having a great inspiration if you don't bother to tell anybody about it. Science can only advance if people learn about new results and develop them further. And that's where women played a crucial role. They explained complicated scientific theories in textbooks, poems, and children's stories. Elizabeth Tollet is just one among many women who were writing and teaching science during the 18th century. And that's why learning about her is so fascinating. Unlike now, poetry was extremely popular in the 18th century and was often used for teaching and learning scientific ideas. But like most other women, it's very hard to find out much information about her. This is her only surviving portrait. We don't even know where she was born or exactly when she moved from one place to another. But because she wrote poetry, we know a great deal about her interior life and opinions. She went to live in the Tower when she was a little girl. After her mother died, she was responsible for looking after the house and her 2 younger brothers. The Tower had long been used as a prison, so the picture on the left is from the 15th century. Anne Boleyn was one of the Tower's most famous occupants, imprisoned there before she was executed. And Tollet wrote a book-length poem about her. Like Anne Boleyn, Elizabeth Tollet was physically confined within the Tower, but she was also a psychological captive, imprisoned by social norms. So in her poem, Tollet is clearly writing about her own loneliness and feelings of entrapment.
Think how I pass the melancholy hours, alone, immured in these relentless towers, my languid head upon my hand in decline, supported only by the conscious mind.
The tower was also a well-fortified military base, which meant it was incredibly noisy. It was full of horses pulling equipment, soldiers, cannon, and even a zoo with lions that roared at night and smelt pretty bad as well. Tollet wrote enviously to her brother at Cambridge.
No noisy guards disturb your blessed retreat.
Another rather surprising inhabitant of the tower was Isaac Newton, who headed the Royal Mint for about 30 years. Most of the Mint's officers were squeezed in between the two outer walls of the tower you can see in the aerial photograph. Newton worked with her father, and she probably met him several times. A diarist reported,
Sir Isaac Newton honoured both him and his daughter with his friendship and was much pleased with some of her essays.
Here essays means attempts, and as Newton loathed poetry, it might be referring to maths. But when I found that quotation, I was really thrilled. There's several detailed biographies of Newton, but none of them mention Elizabeth Tollet. Women were marginalised in the past, and they often still are. Newton also hated the noise and smell of the tower, so he moved out. You can see his London house on the right. But until her father died, Tollet had no option. She lived there in the tower for many years before eventually escaping to the countryside. She lived quietly in Essex, where she had plenty of friends, seems to have been very contented and highly respected. And she continued to study, to write poems about women, science, and Newton. Sir Isaac Newton is most famous for describing the elliptical movements of the planets around the sun. And Tollet's scientific or poetic description is scientifically accurate.
As in proportioned intervals they go, swift in approaches and at distance slow, or in a less or wider space, as his directive force directs their race. 'Tis he compels them in their orbs to keep, though such an influence turns their ample sweep.
By his, Newton meant the sun, which was always masculine, while the moon was feminine. Newton's also famous for his experiments on prisms, which he used to prove that the colours of the rainbow already exist in the white light coming from the sun. And this is how she described the effect.
What various hues the lucid pencils paint, how deep or glaring soften into faint, by what degrees their kindred shades unite, and how their equal mixture spreads a white.
So those lines are from an elegy she wrote when she heard about Newton's death in 1727. In the same poem, she portrayed Newton as a great scientific genius who would be remembered forever.
Immortal and secure thy name remains, which scarce the habitable world contains.
Newton has a large monument in Westminster Abbey. In contrast, Elizabeth Tollet is buried in a small church in West Ham, which used to be the village of Weston in Essex. And this is the epitaph on her memorial stone. The words have been worn away by time and are no longer legible, but I hope that this event will help to preserve her memory.
Memory is like the moon. It has its new, its full, and its wane. Those are the words of Margaret Cavendish. born in 1623 at St. John's Abbey near Colchester. She was a natural philosopher and theoretical physicist. Another woman of Essex that we discussed in Soundings 1. Her work has many resonances with Tollet's, although their lives are not very similar. We hope that Essex will bring their lives and work back from waning to full memory. Religion, justice and benevolence appeared in all her actions, and her poems in various languages are adorned with extensive learning applied to the best purposes. And where will the memory of Tollet take us? Well, it leads us to the work of women living in Essex now, using mathematics in so many different ways to change the world we live in. Some of them through education and poetry still, just as Tollet did, but also through industry, invention and determination. There are women working in Essex who do the most extraordinary jobs, as I've been discovering, and many of them have titles that I simply don't understand, and I'm sure Tollet would have agreed with me. Well, there's that of Sarah Clay, for example, from British Aerospace Systems. Where are you, Sarah?
Hello, Frances. Yes, I'm in Essex. So I would describe my job as a simulation scientist or a modelling engineer. So that is to say that I use computer languages to build mathematical models of various different phenomena that I've been asked to study throughout my work. So for instance, a bit of work that I was recently asked to do was to translate something called Pisarenko's harmonic decomposition, which is a series of equations that can be used to resolve a coherent signal or something useful out of noise. I was asked to translate that from one computer language into another computer language, into a framework that we were sending to ESA, the European Space Agency. So ESA was using this bit of software during the Rosetta mission, which was a spacecraft that was sent out to a comet, to land on a comet a number of years ago. I'm sure everyone's heard about it. It was in the papers for quite a while there. And at the point in time where they specifically wanted to use this bit of software, the spacecraft was orbiting out near Jupiter. As I'm sure you can imagine, the enormous distances involved from Jupiter to Earth mean that the signal that was arriving on Earth was quite faint, especially given that at that point in time, the amount of light that the spacecraft was receiving was quite faint as well, because obviously Jupiter is much further away from the sun than we are. So they wanted to put it into this hibernation mode where it was using the minimal amount of power possible. And that obviously meant that the signal that we were receiving on Earth was very small and very hard to detect. I think we can all imagine that, because we all have the experience of having listened to a radio station and having it disappear on us on a cloudy day, or when we go into a tunnel or something. And so ESA need to use lots of different technology to enable them to stay in contact with this spacecraft all throughout the time where it was so many millions of kilometers away. So they've got lots of different technology to do that. Some of it's hardware, some of it's software. And the bit of software that I was working on is right at the very end. So after the signal has been sent by the spacecraft, received here on Earth and recorded, we then do something called signal processing on that, where we take that data and we do various different mathematical equations and algorithms on it to attempt to resolve something useful out of it. So just remembering where I am up to. So yes, so that's where I was. That's what I was working on, was translating this bit of software. So the first thing that I needed to do, obviously, was understand what this algorithm was about. It's quite a complicated bit of maths. I needed to understand the model because I was working on a bit of work that someone else had already written. So I needed to understand what they'd written and how it applied. I then needed to check to make sure that what they'd written and what I'd written matched. And then I needed to obviously write all of that up to be in some presentable form that we could give to ESA so that they could understand what it was that I'd done. And this is quite a good example of what my day-to-day life is like, what I do on a day-to-day basis of work. I'm given a problem of some description that needs to be solved. I'm either given a bit of software or code that someone else has written, or I'm given some equations that I then need to write software and code for myself. I go off and I understand the underlying mathematical and scientific principles behind that bit of concept or idea that I'm supposed to be working on. I implement or understand the software and code that's already been written. I then solve the many problems that arise throughout all of that, and write all of that up finally in some kind of form that can be delivered to our customers.
So Sarah, I'm with you about this report and how you're solving problems and all the rest of it. But could we just go back to Pisarenko's harmonic decomposition?
Yes.
So I think everybody should try saying this. It's just amazingly good to say Pisarenko's harmonic decomposition. I mean, it's a fantastic phrase.
It is.
You did say that you would take a noise, right? And using maths, you'd make it into something coherent, so it made sense.
Mm-hmm.
And that sounds a little bit like writing music to me.
Yes, I think very much so, yeah.
Though I would like to stress that I tend to compose and not decompose, but all the other elements of it I think are fine. So just for instance, so if we were to make a noise, so if I was to go like that, which is just a noise, everybody at home, you can just amuse yourselves by making your own noise. You don't have to make mine. But if everybody can make a noise with me after 3, 1, 2, 3. It's wonderful this because I can't see, so they could be cheating and not making a noise, but that would really be missing the point. So then we organize that using mathematics, which in musical terms means time, frequency, so changing the pitch, all those kind of things. So if we make that noise together, following me, we could be making a symphony here. See, I'm hoping everyone's doing it. Here we go. And so. Marvelous. Well, I thought that was splendid. It's the best one I've ever heard, actually. And I just wondered, Sarah, does it have any resonances with this graph that you shared with me?
Yes, I think that's quite close.
That's quite. So I'll just write that down, if you don't mind. I'm just kind of writing down like that. So yeah. So the sound. So Sarah and I are making music together with some graphs. There's some graphs hanging around here that we are kind of working on to make some music together. So it does take, I'm being very flippant now, in case you hadn't realized, I'm being very flippant now, that it's not really like that. We have to really work out what's going on underneath the maths and in the graphs to make proper music. But I think a lot of people, I don't know whether some of you would feel this, but I know a lot of people are a bit frightened of maths. But actually, if you're a musician, it is part of what we do. It's part of, these systems and patterns and things. These are things that scientists work with all the time. And I just wondered, Sarah, if you have any thoughts about why people are frightened of mathematics.
Oh, I actually have a very specific thought with regards to that, Frances. I believe that people, in primary school especially, they miss a little bit. They miss something. They miss how to do long division or how to understand fractions. Then when they come on later in their career to use something that is built up from that previous bit of maths that they've missed, they find that they can't understand what's going on. And as a result of that, they developed something called a maths block, where they honestly believe that mathematics is incredibly difficult, incredibly hard to understand, and incredibly impossible to do, simply because they miss the foundational step. It's like building a house out of bricks. If the bottom course of bricks isn't strong and very well together, the whole structure falls down. This actually happened.
You work with this, and yet I think you missed one of these blocks yourself.
Yes, it actually happened to me. When I was in high school, I missed fractions. I had absolutely no idea what was going on, how you added them, divided them, subtracted them. So then later on, when we came to doing algebra, where you have to add and subtract and divide fractions to get it from one side of the equation to the other, I had no idea what was going on, and I couldn't do it at all. But luckily for me, I was able to identify this, and I went off and I found someone to help me through it, to tutor me through it. And from that point on, obviously, I've not had that problem anymore. But I can see how easily that could happen to anybody at any point in time.
Yeah.
And then it just becomes impossible.
I wonder if any of our audience have felt like, if you think you've had this mathematics block, you can always just do a thumbs up on your reaction, so we can see if you're if anyone else has experienced this block, you know, or if you're just a mathematics expert anyway.
Yeah.
And, you know, right?
There we go.
So, but I think in music there's a kind of similar problem, because if you miss a bit, and our education system is gearing towards leaving a lot of musical and arts education behind, which of course is problematic for science, because you can't be a scientist unless you're creative. I mean, it's a given, right?
Yes,
but
absolutely.
I'm kind of thinking that teaching these things is a really important thing. And I wonder if either you or in fact Patricia have ever taught maths.
I once taught maths to my nephew, who was about to do his GCSE, and the big thing I noticed was that he was absolutely terrified, and instead of thinking, he was just trying to remember, and he kept remembering the wrong things. And I eventually got him to calm down, and I took him through simultaneous equations and all sorts of stuff. But the absolutely brilliant thing was he got grade A in maths, so everybody in the family was very pleased with me.
Well done, well done.
So, but another thing I was going to just mention to Sarah, I think a lot of people think that maths is the same as arithmetic. Perhaps you could sort of explain that a bit.
There is an awful lot of arithmetic in maths, but I think I would explain that to you by saying, while all arithmetic is maths, not all maths is arithmetic. So I think that's the best way to explain
There's
that.
a song in that. There's absolutely a song in that. Arithmetic is maths, but not all maths is arithmetic.
That's right.
So I suppose you could think of that when I've seen we've been talking about Isaac Newton and Elizabeth Tollet. When he wrote his book on gravity, the big book, the Principia it's called, he wrote that in geometry because he was a great admirer of the Greeks, and he thought that geometry was the most important mathematical language that there was. And he's famous for inventing calculus, but actually he didn't use that in his big book. He did geometry, which is sort of quite closely linked to art. I mean, it's related to maths, but it's also related to art and architecture.
Was he one of those people who didn't think that women could do maths?
I don't think Isaac Newton thought much about women at all. If you'd asked him, he might have sort of considered that they existed. Certainly in those days, I mean, it was just a general understanding, unless you had an exceptional father like Elizabeth Tollet's father, women couldn't do maths. But one of the things that surprises me is that still seems to be true. And I don't know why that is. And maths is, a lot of people have a block against maths, like my nephew perhaps, but then everybody assumes that women are just not sensible enough to do mathematics. I imagine Sarah doesn't agree with that. But why do you think it is, though, that so many people think that women are especially bad at maths?
Well, I honestly don't know. As you've said, I've always enjoyed mathematics.
I love maths.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I've always had awesome fun doing maths at school. The only explanation I can come down to is that old stereotype that men are logical and reasonable and straight up and down, and women are all creative and free, and maths is considered, yes, very free, and maths is considered to be a very logical, straight up and down sort of a pursuit, and so it naturally suits men and not women. But
don't you think it's quite interesting that people think that that creativity, as in being a composer, is very free? When actually it's being a musician of any kind is an extraordinary discipline. So it's not even, as a stereotype, it's kind of nonsensical, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and also the stereotype of creativity, of being a great artist or being a great musician, the stereotype is that that's a man as well. So I think women just lose hands down, and I think it's one of the reasons why it's interesting studying somebody like Elizabeth Tollet, because you can see then the sort of prejudices that existed, and they seem a bit silly to us now, because she was obviously such a clever woman. And yet when we look at our own society 200 years later, we're still thinking that women can't do maths and that men can be creative. That core attitude just has to change.
Is that something that either of you have experienced, a discrimination because you're women working in science? Because I know, Patricia, although you're presenting as a historian of science, you are actually a physicist.
Well, my first degree was in physics, and when I was at university, there were 8 women and 200 men. And that wasn't so bad. What was really awful was after I left university, I went to London, and I was working. And what I learned after about a week is that if I was at a party or a disco or anything like that, I should the physics degree, because I would find myself in the middle of an empty room. And so I started to lie to pretended that I wasn't a physicist and I hadn't been taught to, because the bias against clever women was so strong then, and thank goodness. I mean, I think it's much, much less now than when I was at university. I mean, Sarah, you're much younger than me. Have you experienced discrimination?
I think I've been very lucky throughout my my career to date. All of the men that I've worked with have been lovely. I've never experienced any overt sexual discrimination. Nothing I can put my finger on, let's put it that way.
Yeah, but that is one of the sort of hidden problems, isn't it? Because although men and women are now paid the same salary for the same work, the fact does remain that on average men earn more in the STEM subjects, and there's more men than women at the top career level. So, I mean, you say there's no overt discrimination, but I think the problem is now we've got to tease out all those hidden prejudices that are prevailing against women.
Yes. There's certainly a lot of prejudices in the music world as well, and of course it's not just against women, it's against minorities and other people as well. So there's a lot of this kind of thing just generally in society at the moment. It's really good that people are starting to really see that in a much stronger way now, which I think is fantastic. And there's a lot of work that's been done leading up to this. This isn't just something that appeared suddenly out of nowhere. Certainly it's a subject that Patricia, I know you've been working on for many years, and promoting women in science. And we've discovered, haven't we, a huge number of women in science from Essex, like Sarah, working now, but also from history, one of whom, of course, was Elizabeth Tollet. And I think it's important that we reflect Elizabeth Tollet when we think about maths, particularly in Essex, that we try to reflect her. And I just wondered, Sarah, if you'd actually heard of her before tonight.
Oh, actually, I have a confession to make. I had never heard of her before tonight. So sorry about that one.
Well, I mean, I'm not surprised, because a lot of people haven't heard of her. But I wonder, now you know that she was from Essex and she was doing a mathematician, you might have been her 200 years ago. So is that important for you, that you share that place in Essex?
Well, again, I only really moved to Essex less than 2 years ago, so the place doesn't have any specific significance to me right now, but perhaps in the future I'm sure it will. Yeah,
well, I mean, in a way, you are rather like Elizabeth Tollet. That's another parallel. I mean, we don't know exactly how old she was when she moved to Essex, but it was certainly sort of halfway through her life. But she lived there for the whole of the rest of her life, and she showed no wish to move. So she obviously found Essex a very, very wonderful place to live. So I hope that you do too for the rest of your career.
Yeah, I'm sure I will, actually.
Is this where we find out, Sarah, that you write poetry as well? Or so I think these connections are really important. I mean, you are as important a connection for Essex as Elizabeth Tollet is to me now, because I think these connections are incredibly important. It's, you know, what is it about Essex that inspires women to do these amazing things? And I've found some great musicians as well. So, for example, Imogen Host, it has enormous connections to Thaxted and the festival there. We recorded some of her work, which we're going to play in a second, which has never been published or recorded before because it was written for students to sing when she was teaching. It kind of gives, the reason we've chosen this is because it kind of gives a sense of loss and loneliness. And I know there's a bit of Tollet's story, Patricia, that you haven't touched on yet, which is, you know, she never married, and there was some kind of loss that she had when she was quite young, I believe.
Well, she had a very wide network of friends, and a lot actually about death. But the one that's really, really, really rest to some of the.
Oh, I think everybody else might not have heard that. I think that's Patricia's telling us about Dee Dee.
DDD. She wrote a poem, and it was just addressed in 3 initials, DDD. We have no idea who DDD was. There's no indication in the poem whether she was referring to a man or referring to a woman, but it was obvious that Tollet had suffered a great loss when she died. It's a very moving poem.
Sorrow has untuned my voice to sing. I couldn't help but set this. We actually sang this at the Science Museum many years ago when we were doing a project about Ada Lovelace, the first computer programmer. But to go back to Holst, so Imogen Holst, I'm sure most of you will have heard of Gustav Holst, or at least you'll have heard The Planets. It's a very famous piece that's used a lot. But his daughter was Imogen, and she wrote this piece for her students to sing. So it really gives us that sense of loss and loneliness, and the power of words and music and of love. And I think that we were very lucky because we have an artist called Jack Cornell who's made a beautiful video which goes with this very short piece of music, which is performed by the Electric Voice Theatre singers. And I think that it's really, truly our duty of all of us here to ensure that the floods will not drown Elizabeth Tollet's voice.
Set me as a